And today we're so pleased to have with us Dr. Angela Carpenter. She is Associate Professor of Reformed Theology at Hope College and has been on the faculty at Hope since 2017. Her focus is on Christian theology and ethics with an emphasis on Reformed theology. And her latest project is a book on grace and social ethics. And I had a chance to Google her name, and up popped the Hope Chapel that she presented at maybe last year, the year before, on Christ and creation, which was really interesting and ties in with our sermons lately. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that as well. So welcome, Dr. Carpenter.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's good to be with you all. I coerced my family into coming, and they're the ones applauding for me. So thank you. It's really a privilege to be here and get to just share a little bit about what I've been working on in this book in the past few years. So the book as a whole is on the connection between grace and social ethics. You might think, is there a connection between grace and social ethics? I hope to convince you that yes, there is. Obviously, I can't condense an entire book into one 60-minute adult class. So what I'm going to talk about today is two parts. One, I'm going to try and provide a synopsis of my understanding of Christian grace. And then talk about it in relation to one particular social issue, the issue of work. So we're used to thinking about grace and works in theology, good works and that sort of thing. But today we're talking about work in terms of the kind that we get paid for. So basically, I want to think about who we are as creatures who live by God's gifts, and what that means for the lives we live together in community together. So I want to say just a little bit about what got me interested in a project on grace and social ethics by talking about some broader perspectives I think we see in broader Christian culture. So first of all, I think you find a particular perspective among conservative Protestants that goes something like this. And bear in mind, these are caricatures, but I think they are identifiable, where the perspective is what really matters in terms of the life of a Christian is that people have faith in Jesus. Concerns about social justice are a distraction because we're saved through faith, not through our works. Focusing the effort of the church on issues of justice takes away from the critical mission of preaching the gospel and calling people to faith. So I think that's one perspective we might find in thinking about grace and justice or social issues. And it's one that actually recently has been made quite explicit if you spend much time on social media. I'm guessing a lot of you don't spend much time on social media, but anybody know who Jordan Peterson is? Don't worry about it. It's not important. But someone who gets a lot of publicity for saying very provocative things. He's not even a Christian, but recently said something to the effect of, Christians, if your pastor is talking about social justice, you need to find a new church. That's not what the church should be about. Again, he's not even claiming to be a Christian, so I'm not sure why he wants to give Christians advice. But you find that kind of rationality out there. On the other hand, I think you get a liberal, progressive Protestant response that is a reaction against this. It wants to say that the traditional Protestant understanding of personal salvation is a distortion of the New Testament. Am I doing something weird with this mic? Sorry about that. Is that better? Good. That's a distortion of the New Testament, especially of Jesus's proclamation of the kingdom of God. So I think a lot of times progressive Christians want to focus less on grace and salvation, forgiveness of sins, and instead really emphasize the kingdom that Jesus preached and discipleship. So Christian witness is compromised by a lack of concern for justice for the poor and oppressed. So part of my motivation in working on this project is thinking about these two perspectives and wanting to provide an alternative. I'll give you a little secret. This is what academics do. We often say there's position X and position Y, and I disagree with both of these, and I'm going to provide a third thing for you. Again, I'm an academic, so that's what I'm going to try to do today as well. What I want to argue in the book that I'm writing is that a Christian theology of grace, including our faith in Jesus and personal salvation and forgiveness of sins, all of that actually calls for a social ethic. It requires a social ethic. So I want to tease that out a little bit by talking some more about grace, as I understand it in the Christian tradition, and then talking specifically about what the implications might be for just this one topic of work. All right, so in talking about grace and humanity or human nature, I want to focus on three key ideas. The first two might be a little dense theologically. I'm going to apologize for that in advance. Again, I'm trying to condense sort of the ideas of a book into a very short format here. And instead of, I think what I'll do instead of presenting everything and then taking questions at the end, I'll pause after some of this for some questions because some of it is just a little bit dense. The first key idea in a Christian understanding of grace is dependence on God. And this actually goes really well with the sermon series that we've had the last few weeks, looking at the beginnings of creation in the book of Genesis. As Protestants especially, when we think of grace, usually what we think about is forgiveness of sin. That's kind of the stereotype in theology of Protestant understandings of grace that's entirely focused on forgiveness of sin. Grace is certainly about forgiveness of sin. I certainly don't want to imply that that's not the case. But what I want to try to convey is that grace is much deeper than that and runs all the way through the biblical story. Beginning with creation, again, what we've been talking about the last several weeks, human beings begin in grace. Our very existence is the result of God's grace. We are not the source of our existence. We don't create ourselves. We receive life and all of our abilities, anything that we have, our sustenance, our forgiveness and transformation. Everything comes from God, and we are radically dependent on God giving us these things. Really important here, I'm going to remove my jacket now that the heat is on and might require me to readjust the mic too. All right. See if I can get this correct. Here, is that right? I seem to have totally messed this up now. I apologize. Yes? Okay. All right. So one thing that's really important, because dependence kind of has a bad rep in our very individualistic culture. So one thing that's really important to understand here is that God, in creating us, it's not like God has some kind of secret agenda that is to benefit God. You actually get this in some other ancient Near Eastern creation stories where the gods create human beings essentially to be slaves of the gods, so the gods can rest and to do all the work. That's not the case in the Christian story. And in fact, it can't be. God in God's self is completeness, bliss, perfect love. And so anything that God creates is pure gift, not to benefit God in any way, because God has no lack. God has no sort of hole that could be benefited by human beings. So all of human life is pure gift. If you imagine this in terms of a married couple having a child, say you are counseling a married couple, and they say to you, after you ask, well, why do you want to have a child? And they say, well, our marriage was really in trouble, and we thought having a child might bring us together. You'd be like, not so sure about this. Sounds like a bad idea to me. That's exactly not what God's creation about. God doesn't have some kind of secret agenda. Instead, God is simply interested in sharing God's love. The couple that says, well, we're just so in love that we just want to make that love greater by having a child. We just want to expand that love. So in Christian theology, God's creation, and in fact, all of God's actions are this one act of overflowing love. And in Jesus, the incarnation, the life and death and resurrection of Jesus is that one act of God's overflowing love when that overflowing love meets a sinful, rebellious creation. So the idea here is that grace runs deeply throughout all of Christian theology and that we are dependent on God. The corollary of this is we're meant to live as creatures who are dependent on God's gift, in trust, in friendship and fellowship with God, in gratitude. There are two ways we kind of fail to do this. We can fail to do this if we say, I want to do it on my own. I don't need God. I can be the source of everything for myself. This we get in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve succumb to the temptation to be like God. We want to be gods on our own, provide everything for ourselves, not have to rely on God for anything for us. We can also fail to do this in a more religious way. This is what the reformers really worried about, Martin Luther and John Calvin, and some of the magisterial reformers. We can fail to do this when we think, oh, I rely on God for everything. That's really scary. I better do anything I can to appease God, to make sure that God likes me, to make sure that God is going to take care of me. Well, what can I do? Well, let's get this list of things that I'm going to do to make sure that God loves me, that God's going to take care of me. And what's really interesting, Luther and Calvin said that impulse to, through our works, make sure that God loves us, to make sure that God's going to take care of us. What that actually does is that interrupts true fellowship with God. Because our goal is really not to be in relationship with God. Our goal is just to make sure we have what we want or what we need. So we are so focused on our self-anxiety that we don't really have the freedom for communion or fellowship with God. But grace, on the other hand, the gifts of God, which we don't have to earn, we don't have to deserve, they come to us. Those actually provide freedom for authentic, genuine relationship with God, where we can be focused on the relationship itself. By the way, if you've read the book of Job, this is the dilemma that the beginning of the book of Job is really wrestling with. Job doesn't really love you. Job's just interested in all of the stuff that you've given him. You've blessed him so much. Take that away. Job's not going to love you. So this idea that we only do things, we're only coming to church today, not to be with God in some way and have communion with others, but just to make sure we're in God's good graces. Luther and Calvin said, no, that's the antithesis of grace and the loving relationship with God that we're meant to have. One final thing here, we think of dependent as being passive. This is kind of our cultural presuppositions that we kind of need to get past. The kind of dependency that I'm talking about is not passive. It's actually gift enabling action. It's because God loves us and gives us the gift of existence and the abilities that God has given us that we are able to act. So God's gift, God's grace, in terms of being dependent on God, doesn't create a passivity. It's what actually allows us to act in the first place. That's going to become really important when we talk about this next point. So I wanted to be sure to keep that in mind. Okay, let me pause for a second. As I said, I'm moving through some dense theological ideas kind of quickly here. Anybody have any questions, thoughts, reflections?
Not going to help that relationship. It's only Can't sit back and just accept whatever she has. I've got to be a participant in that as well. I think that's a model a bit of what that's like.
Yes, absolutely. And that really leads into the next point, which is the corollary of dependence on God is interdependence in human community. And this is where it goes both ways. God doesn't need anything from us. We can't fill any lack God has because God doesn't have any lack. When we talk about human community, then we're talking about this mutuality of action, giving and receiving. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions or thoughts before I move on to this second point? Okay. So this is a corollary of dependence on God. So our nature of dependence on God is reflected in interdependence in human community. One way I like to put this is it would be really strange if, as Christians, we said, we don't have to earn our salvation. We don't earn forgiveness from God. We receive it as a gift. And this is the basis of our relationship with God. But then we went out into the world and said to everyone we meet, you have to prove yourself. You have to earn your own way. And if I said of myself, I have to earn and establish my own way in human community, that would be a pretty strong disjunction. I think it would kind of split our humanity to think that we're one way with God. We live by grace, we live by gift and trust and gratitude. And then to think in human community, it's exactly the opposite. We have to earn what we receive in this really strict accounting. You can see how this might be leading into thinking or reflecting about work in human community in a little bit. So instead, we're meant to live by grace in our relationship to God, but not to expect self-sufficiency and independence, absolute independence in human relationship, but rather the mutuality of give and take. And this is really because in interdependent human community, we're the means of God's giving. God's gifts to us usually come through other people. So we come to church and we receive communion, and it is our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ who present the elements to us. We are the means of God's gifts to one another. And in fact, Scripture actually tells us this is the way that we love God. Remember how I said God actually doesn't need anything from us? That's kind of strange because that makes it difficult to love God if there's nothing we can give to God. But what God says is, I so love my creation that I identify with this creation. So when you love other people, you're also loving me. When you love the least of these, it was me that you fed. It was me that you gave a cup of water. It was me that you visited in prison. So in interdependent human community, we are the means of God's giving to one another. And when we do this, we love one another. We're also loving God. I said it's odd to think of separating these two, dependence on God and then thinking of ourselves as interdependent in human community. I do think it's odd, but it's actually what we often try to do in our individualistic culture. We make these assumptions all the time. We insist on self-sufficiency. We think needing help diminishes us. I can't be the only one. I have a really hard time asking for help. Does anyone else struggle with this? I think if I need help, I have failed in some way. There's something deeply wrong with me if I need help. But the picture of humanity that flows from a theology of grace doesn't say this at all. There's the expectation that everyone needs help. Everyone needs grace. Everyone needs other people. That's what it means to be interdependent. And so if we have these assumptions that we're all supposed to be self-sufficient and that needing help from someone else is some kind of failure, then we're really inviting a distorted picture of human nature. Side note here, so part of this book has a science component to it, and I have a chapter on human evolution that actually and really strikingly confirms this intuition. And this is actually, Lori mentioned the talk that I gave at Hope Chapel, touches on this idea as well. We're used to thinking of evolution being all about survival of the fittest and competition, right? That's what you think of when you think of evolution. The most recent research on human evolution is actually finding that cooperation, human beings being able to live in community and help one another and give to one another and work together, has been crucial in the evolution of the species. That we evolved as a species of creatures who need one another, who survive by the gifts of one another, who don't survive on our own, who survive through working together. So that's a bit of a side note, but the picture of humanity that I'm talking about here, flowing from a theology of grace, I want to say we actually, in our empirical study of humanity, we can see glimmers of the same anthropology. Okay, those were like the more sort of dense theological points. The next one, which just flashed up here, is going to be a lot more familiar to you. Before we move on to that one, questions? Is this making sense? Is it way too like dense to follow? I hope that's not the case, but I can try and better explain. Pastor Ryan has a question. Oh, thanks.
Typically illustrate through points 1 and 2 where you see, or if there is, I guess, how the biblical idea of covenant seems to be woven through here too.
Yeah, no, excellent question. And this is a tricky Reformed question for me, right? Because not in Calvin and some of the magisterial reformers, but in especially the English Reformed tradition, you get this covenant of works and covenant of grace. And the covenant of works basically says, when God created Adam and Eve, God gave Adam and Eve a law, don't touch this tree. And if they obeyed that law, then God was going to bless them. So kind of transactional. It's not going to surprise you to hear me say, as a historian and theologian in the Reformed tradition, but with the presentation that I've given you here, I think the covenant of works was a huge misstep in the Reformed tradition. It just totally gets wrong this beginning in grace. Now, covenant itself, as a part of the biblical narrative, I think is very consistent with the idea of grace. So in Genesis 12, when God comes to Abraham, God makes a covenant with Abraham, not based on anything that Abraham's done. From all we know in Genesis, God just plucks Abraham out of like seeming nowhere. We've heard nothing of Abraham so far. And God says, I'm making a covenant with you. Abraham's not done anything to deserve it. Now, Abraham does go on to display tremendous faith, to walk with God. So there's definitely some mutuality here. It's not just that God makes a covenant with Abraham and there's no reciprocity, but I see the covenant itself as founded in grace. And any sort of like effort to begin with a covenant of works is like apostasy. I hate it. So yes, excellent question. Thank you for that. Any other reflections, thoughts? All right. To the sort of much more familiar and hopefully easier idea to wrap our head around. Within a theology of grace, human worth is given, it is not earned. So if all that we are comes from God and there's nothing independent of what we have been given, we don't provide for our own existence, our existence is given by God, then there's nothing outside of gift in which we could ground our own value. Even though we try to do this all the time, I'm valuable because, I've been successful academically and I've become a professor and I've done these things. That's really a misstep theologically. Spiritually, in my own spiritual life, what I should be seeking is a greater understanding of my value coming solely from God's love. You'll notice, and again, come back to Genesis, which we've been studying the last several weeks. In Genesis 1, we are given the divine image. It's not the case that God says, well, humanity, they're doing pretty good. I think I'm going to give them this gift of being in my image. No, they're just made in the divine image. This kind of sacredness of humanity in the biblical story comes as a gift from the very beginning. Even sin does not abolish human worth. Quite the contrary. Sin is the occasion of God's greatest gift. God does not abandon, as we learned this morning, right? God does not abandon human beings in sin, but loves and continues to show grace to humanity, especially, of course, in the incarnation, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And the salvation, this is a key theme of the Apostle Paul in his writings in the New Testament. God's salvation in Jesus does not depend on any human characteristics. It is simply given, regardless of whether one is Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free. And we could update those to add some of the divisions of our own culture that we like to separate by, but that is not how God's grace works. Now, this notion of universal human worth has been so permeating Western culture for such a long time that it's almost cliched, right? The human person has inherent dignity, has inherent worth. It's something that most people in our culture would affirm if you ask them. So it's cliche, I say, except for when it's not. Because even though it's cliched, even though I think everyone would buy into this idea that humans have dignity, what even a secular person would say inherent worth, I think. People of many religious traditions would say worth given by God, but that still that idea that it's not something that we have to create for ourselves or earn in some way. We give lip service to that all the time, and I think we constantly contradict it all the time as well in our actions and in our assumptions. And we're going to see more of this when we come to the theme of work. But I just wanted to mention that because it sounds almost like a platitude when I say it. But I think it's actually really important to note that we actually are violating this constantly. Okay, pause there. I'm going to switch over to the work portion. But any questions here? This is a very condensed version of like part 1 of my book where I go through Christian theology of grace. All right, so I want to talk about what this then means for ethics, but in the interest of time, I was going to say something about Luther here. Man, I think I'll go ahead and say it. Luther is awesome. I love Luther. Sorry, I know I'm in a Reformed church. I also love Calvin. On this particular point, Calvin pretty much follows Luther. Luther's treatise on the freedom of a Christian, Calvin pretty much takes and rewrites in his own words and puts it in the Institutes. There's a whole chapter called Christian freedom, and it's basically the same idea. So, but I think this is important because the argument that I'm making that grace calls for an ethic is actually one that the Reformers made as well. So Luther says, knowing God accepts you, not because you've somehow earned it through your actions, but because of Jesus, he thinks sets you free from a constant anxiety. Prior to his great epiphany, Luther himself had constant anxiety about salvation. He thought he had never done enough, confessed enough. There was a theology in Luther's era that was really popular that basically said, yeah, you're saved by grace, but you have to do your part before you'll get the gift of grace. And Luther was like, oh, I never know if I've done enough to merit God's grace. He had this constant anxiety. And so this liberation that he experienced was that it wasn't up to him, that it was purely by God's gift, that God loved him. This grace for Luther had a moral dimension. If a person thinks that they need to earn God's approval, then their actions are never really for the sake of that good action itself. That person's actions are always, I'm trying to earn God's approval. That's why I'm going to go volunteer at this homeless shelter. That's why I'm going to go to church every Sunday. And it totally bypasses like wanting to go to the homeless shelter because I want to share love to people who are unhoused, or wanting to come to church because I want to be in fellowship with other believers and want to learn about God. So for Luther, there was this tension, this moral dimension, that grace set a person free, liberated someone to really love God and be able to do good works for the sake of the works themselves. So Luther thinks if everything has already been given by God, and this is what he says in his treatise on the freedom of a Christian, everything we could possibly need, including the hope of eternity with God, then a person is truly free to serve other people, not make them instruments for some personal objective. If I help this person out, maybe they'll help me in the future. But just being able to give oneself sacrificially on behalf of others. If God has given through all of God's gifts to me everything I need, then I am set free to radically and deeply give myself on behalf of others. That was what Luther thought. So, you know, the Lutheran tradition sometimes gets slammed for like sort of being against good works, especially by the Reformed. I told you I really am kind of a Luther fan. Luther himself really gave this really moving, profound, impassioned call for Christians to just spend themselves on behalf of the world for the good of other people. Okay, so let's talk about work. I have a quote here from Ivanka Trump. Ivanka Trump says, "I don't think most Americans in their heart want to be given something. I spent a lot of time traveling around this country over the last 4 years. People want to work for what they get." I don't often say this. I think Ivanka Trump is right. I think this is a common ethos in American culture. I think this sense that we get our value through work. Don't give me something that's undignified. I'll tell you another story. This is a bit of a sidetrack, but something else that was sort of a touch point for me in working on this project. I was at a conference at the Acton Institute. Does anyone know what the Acton Institute is in Grand Rapids? Yeah, I was at a conference at the Acton Institute. And the topic of the talk that I was at was Jesus a socialist? You know anything about the Acton Institute, you know the presumed answer to this question was no. By no means was Jesus a socialist. But one really fascinating interchange at this talk was in the Q&A, someone asked the speaker what he thought about reparations for slavery and for the injustices of racism. And he said, "I really think it's an assault to someone's dignity to give them something they haven't earned." And I was just like taken aback. And this is a Christian speaker. How can a Christian say it's an assault to human dignity to be given something we haven't earned? But I think that's because that is so deeply ingrained in our individualistic culture. I have to do things for myself. I have to earn them. If anyone gives me a handout, then that's somehow degrading to me. So yes, I think Ivanka Trump is onto something here. I want to talk about some of these common beliefs culturally we have about work. These are ones I've noticed. After we go through my list here, we'll see if you have any to add, or maybe you want to disagree with some of mine. I will say here, I'm putting these up here not with any particular judgment as we're listing them. Some of these, I think, yeah, there's really something to this, maybe in a qualified sense, I would say. Others I would disagree with entirely, but that's just a disclaimer there. So I think we think work is, and I say we here in terms of American popular culture, work is fundamentally and inherently dignified. Working is morally good, not working is immoral or lazy. The strong good are self-sufficient and the weak are dependent. This is something I've already been talking about. Work confers value on a person. We might not say that explicitly, but I think we act like that in the way we think about our jobs and careers. I know I'm speaking to an audience also of many retirees, so there's kind of an irony in choosing this talk, but maybe you identify this with some of the work you do in retirement or with the work that you did prior to retirement. We tend to think certain types of work confer greater value than others. Again, maybe not explicitly, but I think if you've ever worked in a service profession, for example, you've experienced people certainly treating you as if your work confers a different kind of value. Work is often where we find our primary identity, and work is often where we find meaning in life. And this last one may be the most controversial, but often I think we act as though human beings exist for the sake of work and productivity rather than work being for the sake of humanity. Okay, let me pause there. What do y'all think? You think I'm right about these? Anything you want to add? Anything you disagree with?
Right. I think it's more complicated than that.
Sure.
Okay, so I think those things are right, but for many years I've worked with Bread for the World and on hunger issues. And I think the complication in there that people, because they think this way, they don't want to understand that people also make policies that hurt others.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to accept that. They only want it to be black and white.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you on that. I think a lot of our policies sort of like flow from this understanding of work, and when it doesn't quite fit human beings, it really can be destructive. Yeah.
Our West Michigan culture adds a nice asterisk if you are female and have children.
Uh-huh.
And then, oh, but your work is in the house, and that's very important.
Yes.
But if you are not female and do not have children and work in the house or do not have a job, so yes, I agree with all of this, but there's also a strong and almost a counter, like if you are a woman who has small children and you are in the workplace, then it is a negative on you. It's you really, I'll pray for you. I'm so sorry that you have to work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. My kids go to a charter school where the assumption is just someone is available to pick the children up at 3 o'clock every day, which I think is part of this sort of West Michigan assumption about how work in the family works as well. Yeah, no, that's a point well taken. I would say the exception to that is a single parent household, especially a single mother household, where then the expectation is, oh, and also you need to work productively in the paid economy as well in order to have a kind of value. Then it's like bad if you're just taking care of your children. There's sort of a belittling of the work of the home that I think is common in broader culture, not so much in West Michigan, but broader American culture, the sort of sense that the work of the home caring for children doesn't have the same kind of value as work in the paid economy too. Yeah, good point. Other thoughts here? Okay. I want to argue that there's much to be said. I don't want to completely reject our broader cultural understanding of work. I think there is a lot of dignity in work. I would rephrase that as the human person has dignity. And when work respects the dignity of the human person, then that work is also dignified. So I have a really high value of human agency and activity. But I think the particular way our culture understands it is deeply problematic, again, because it's not recognizing this sort of foundation in gift, the origin of everything in gift. So what is this dark side of work that comes up? Work is dignified and morally good. Maximize work. You should work more. If work is dignified, if work is good, then the more we work, the better we are. And I think in certain circles, you can get kind of competition. Well, I worked so much last week is sort of bragging. It's on the one hand, kind of complaining, oh, it was so hard, but also sort of bragging. I'm so good. I worked so much. We maximize work. Are any of you familiar with just-in-time scheduling? The sense that an employer will use sort of computer algorithms to determine what the highest need is for workers and schedule people kind of at the last minute based on all this data that they're taking in. So a worker at a Starbucks, for example, might get a call the night before, oh, you need to work tomorrow from 5 a.m. to lunchtime. And it doesn't matter if the Starbucks worker needed to be home with her children at 5 a.m. in the morning who are still asleep in bed. There's very little time for planning or organizing ordinary human life. Or someone might show up to work and they're told, oh, wait, we no longer need you, go home. So this kind of like scheduling instability, I think, flows from this idea that work is what is most important and the human person is for work in this sense. Sometimes even rest is for the sake of work. If one really values one's work, one might say, well, I really need to get some sleep tonight so I can be more productive tomorrow. This is not at all the idea of the Sabbath rest in Scripture. Rest is for its own sake for the human person. Rest is for communion with God, for communion with other people. Rest is sort of the end point, the reason for which everything else takes place during the week is to have this day of rest. Also, increasingly, we're finding if work is dignified and morally good, childhood is for the sake of work. There's a recent legislative effort in many states to take away barriers of child labor, for example. But I think even apart from that, there's a conception of childhood that is forcing more and more on children, heavier burdens of homework, more pressures to achieve, get this list of things on a resume for a college application, that kind of thing. And less a sense that childhood is for play and exploration and discovery. This is a Catholic philosopher who wrote a book on leisure in the mid-20th century. I think it's just a really powerful expression of this idea. Joseph Pieper, the inmost significance of the exaggerated value which is set upon hard work appears to be this. Man seems to mistrust everything that is effortless. He can only enjoy with good conscience what he has acquired with toil and trouble. He refuses to have anything as a gift. I don't know about you. Do you ever have a hard time just not working, not being productive? Sometimes I do, yeah. I think we also tend to think work confers value. We don't say this, but I think the way we act is that some jobs lend certain people more value and worth than others. And that just justifies different rights and privileges associated with different work. The COVID pandemic, I think, really exposed some of these faulty assumptions that we have about work. So when the quarantines first hit and it was only essential workers that are supposed to go out, many people who derive great sense of value and worth, I would put myself in this category, from work, found that actually we weren't really that crucial to the functioning of society after all, shockingly. And so many people who are often, socially and culturally relegated to a lower status, the people who are delivering our Amazon packages are the ones who are like really keeping everything going, people who are working in the grocery stores. So there's really a mismatch, I think, culturally in how we understand work and value. Then work where we find identity, meaning, and purpose. These are theological claims. by the way. If meaning, identity, and purpose comes from work, that's a theological claim about what the world is like. But can work deliver on these claims? When we look to employment, to a job or work in other spheres, even if we don't get paid for it, for our sense of meaning and our value as a person, we really put our mental health at risk. We're putting ourselves at risk of burnout. I'm not sure work can deliver on those promises of really conferring profound value to us. The claims of grace, on the other hand, and this is where I'm going to end, we'll have about 10 minutes or so for a discussion here. As they relate to work, again, human value is not earned by what we do, by our actions, but given by God. All of our working is the result of prior gifts, and so it can't be the source of differential worth or value. If everything that we've received, even the abilities that we have to do certain things well and to contribute our labor to the common good, which is a good thing to do, that actually comes from God. It's not something we can point to and say, this is me, without also acknowledging it's a gift of God. And that tempers our desire to make that the source of our own value. In an economy of grace, you might say we are gifts to one another. This gets back to that interdependence. Work actually is important. It is important that we do things with our time that contribute to the good of other people. This is what it means to be a creature living in community with others. I think it's more helpful, however, to see all of us as gifts to one another and to really think about how everyone can participate. So often we take whole segments of our population and we say, you don't have anything to offer to the common good, especially with disabled individuals. I think we do that. So instead, cultivating this sense that we are gifts to one another. Human life is for fellowship with God and neighbor. So important to remind ourselves, work is not the purpose. We're not working for the sake of work, but we're working for the sake of human community. We're working so that we can be in communion with one another, so that we can be in communion with God. Rest is therefore more fundamental than work to human meaning and purpose. Work is for the sake of rest, not vice versa. And then lastly, I think this is really, really fascinating. The sin of sloth in the Christian tradition is not actually about a lack of work. It's about a lack of love. So sloth is one of the 7 deadly sins in the Christian tradition, but the theologians who describe sloth describe it as a sin against the virtue of charity. Sloth is an unwillingness to exert ourselves on behalf of love of God or neighbor. So what this means, this is pretty ironic. You can imagine someone who spends 80 hours or more a week working in a particular profession, working in a job, and in the process, ignoring relationships in their life, not investing in their children, not investing in their community, maybe working in a job that at the end of the day doesn't really provide that much good for human society on a whole. I'm sure you can't imagine any jobs that you think would fit into that category. And you could actually say that person is slothful, even though they're like working and getting paid for work extremely long hours. In a theological sense, if work is not for the sake of love, then that's not really what the vice of sloth is about. On the flip side, you could have someone who doesn't work at, this gets back to Laura's point, doesn't work at all in the paid economy, but spends their days doing a lot of things that are offering gifts of love to other people, caring for children, maybe being involved in volunteering in the community. And that is not sloth at all, even though our broader culture might disparage the value of that person. Okay, so re-envisioning work, what I would suggest, absolute claims of work on the person are idolatrous. So in terms of a social ethic, I would really want to limit the ability of employers to make absolute claims on their employees. Human beings are not for the sake of work. So I'm thinking of this kind of just-in-time scheduling here as one example of this. Work is for the sake of human life and community, and in that sense, it has value and meaning. Work is dignified insofar as it allows a person to contribute their gifts and thus share in God's giving to and care for creation. Work is dignified insofar as it respects and is oriented toward the fundamental purpose of fellowship with God and neighbor. Different treatment of workers. So I'm not saying everyone should get paid absolutely the same amount or everyone should be treated exactly the same. I think there can be differences I'm not opposed to markets determining different pay for different work. I just think this needs to fall within this broader umbrella of differential treatment is only justified within the bounds of these broader criteria. That work can't make absolute claims on a human person, that work has to honor the dignity of a person with working conditions that are dignified, for example. An example of this, as I was writing my chapter about work, the state of Texas voted to abolish local ordinances that required water breaks for people working outside. So that's just one example of, I think, many, many ways in which we aren't really concerned if a lot of work situations are honoring human dignity or not. So, all right, that's what I have for you. Now we have, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, not too much time, but about 5 minutes for a few more question and answers.
A familiar phrase kept coming to my mind this morning. We pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps.
Yes.
And so familiar.
Yeah.
And I probably didn't learn of its ridiculousness until later in life.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for saying that, because this sense that we need one another, I think, is really consistent with a broader way of structuring society where we say, okay, who needs help, assistance, who needs gifts in order to have agency, in order to be able to act, instead of just assuming that we all pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Did you have a question too?
Just a couple reflections on this whole thing. I would say that while work does not confer meaning and value, I would say that the work I've done is a way of living out the meaning and value that I feel. And by doing my work well, it is a way of pleasing God because I'm using the gifts that He's given me.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's a little more nuance than some of this in terms of how you do what you do. And I would say even things like just in time, which in my experience, that's much more an inventory system than it is a people system, which is a way of conserving resources.
Yes,
minimizing
absolutely.
waste. And so again, I think there's a flip side to a whole lot of this, that if we live as Christians in what we do and how we do it, it can be a way of living in God's, His grace, and of conveying that to those we work with.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely 100% agree with that. I don't mean to suggest in any way that it's somehow wrong to find meaning in the work that we do. As I'm speaking to you, this is in part an office of the work that I do. When that meaning is put within this context of our broader interdependence in human community and dependence on God, then I actually think it's really crucial to say to every single person, you have something to contribute. And yes, we do hope that you will find meaning in making that contribution. And it's important to identify the subtle differences between that and between saying my life only has value and meaning in the work that I do. And yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I think that's a really important clarification. The scheduling thing I think is really interesting because yeah, these technologies of scheduling had their origin in getting resources to the right place at the right time. And then people started applying them to human beings as if human beings are just like all these other resources. And that's where I think we get into trouble when we start treating people like the things. I think Steve had a question.
So I have my own mic. I think Luther and Calvin spoke to the ratio of your highest paid worker and your lowest paid worker. And I thought one of them thought the ratio, it was legitimate or moral for it to be, let's say, 5-1, or one said 7-1. And the CEO of GE makes 32,000 times per hour what the lowest paid person does. Does that, can you comment on that, or does that fit into your thinking here at all?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The wages and inequality, I think, are an important piece of this, in part because we look to wages as a way of assessing worth and value. So the message that sends is that the CEO is like really that much more important than all the ordinary people in the life of the business. So with respect to Luther and Calvin, that's really interesting. I hadn't found them specifically identifying any like point of legitimacy of inequality, although I did read a lot of what each of them had to say about care for the poor and about labor and economics. Calvin has some really fascinating quotations on this. So at one point, Calvin, he almost sounds like Karl Marx. I'm like, not even kidding here. At one point, he says to this wealthy landowner, hypothetical person he's speaking to, you think just because this worker doesn't have any alternative, doesn't have choice, can't go anywhere else, that you can pay that person half of what they need to live off of. And Calvin basically says that's evil, that's exploitation. God is going to get you for that, basically is what Calvin says there. So yeah, even Luther and Calvin identified these theological points that they were making. They had material social implications. I think that's a really important point. So yeah, thank you. I think we are officially out of time. I'll turn it back over to Lori. Thank you all so much for engaging these ideas and for letting me talk.
Let's say thanks.